Canada just moved into the center of the global LNG fight, and Shell is trying to lock in the gas before the world fully prices it in. Your energy bills, your jobs, your investments, and your country's security are now tied to a cold stretch of coastline in British Columbia. Most people are watching the crisis in the Middle East, but Shell appears to be watching the next route out. Because this is not just another oil and gas deal. This is what happens when a global shipping crisis meets Canada's biggest energy opening in a generation. For months, the world has been reminded of one hard truth. Energy security is not a speech. It is ships, ports, pipelines, gas fields, contracts, crews, insurance, and sea lanes. And when one sea lane gets threatened, every buyer on Earth starts looking for another way in. That way may now run through Canada's Pacific coast, not through the Persian Gulf, not through the Strait of Hormuz, not through the Panama Canal. Through Kitimat, British Columbia, where LNG Canada has already loaded its first cargo, where Shell owns the largest stake in the project, and where a second phase could double output if the partners make the final investment decision. Then came the move that made the market look twice. On April 27, 2026, Shell announced an agreement to acquire ARC Resources, a Calgary-based company with major exposure to the Montney gas basin in British Columbia and Alberta. The deal carries an enterprise value of about 16.4 billion US dollars, or roughly 22 billion Canadian dollars, including debt in Canadian reporting. But here is the important detail. This is not simply Shell writing one giant cash check. Shell says the deal is mostly shares, with about 3.4 billion US dollars in cash, about 10.2 billion US dollars in Shell shares, and the assumption of debt and leases. That matters because it shows this is not just a purchase. It is a long-term bet. Shell is not buying a random gas producer. ARC sits in the Montney, one of North America's most important gas and liquids regions. Shell already has Groundbirch in British Columbia and Gold Creek in Alberta. ARC's assets are close to Shell's existing footprint. That means Shell is not wandering into new territory. It is tightening its grip around a region it already understands. And that region points west. Shell's Groundbirch gas already supplies LNG Canada. Shell owns 40% of LNG Canada. LNG Canada sits on the Pacific coast. Asian buyers are now more nervous about Middle East supply routes. Put those pieces together and the logic becomes clear. This is about control. Control of supply. Control of timing. Control of costs. Control of future growth. Control of a Canadian LNG platform at the exact moment the global LNG map has been shaken. To understand why Shell is moving now, you have to look far away from Alberta and British Columbia. You have to look at the Strait of Hormuz. Recent reporting from Reuters said some oil and LNG tankers were stranded for nearly 3 months because of the Iran and Hormuz crisis, before finally moving out toward buyers in Asia. That matters because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. A huge share of the world's oil and LNG moves through that narrow passage. When traffic through that route slows, the whole market feels it. Japan feels it. South Korea feels it. China feels it. India feels it. Europe feels it too, because Europe already learned after Russia's invasion of Ukraine that energy dependence can become political weakness almost overnight. LNG can move by ship, but ships still need safe routes. They need export terminals. They need insurance. They need crews. They need buyers who believe the cargo will arrive. When tankers sit in the Gulf for months, trust begins to crack. The International Energy Agency has also warned that damage and disruption tied to Qatar's LNG system could delay expected global LNG growth and create a possible 120 billion cubic meter supply loss from 2026 through 2030. That is not a small number. That is a market warning. It tells Asian utilities to secure cargoes early. It tells governments to diversify supply before the next crisis. It tells energy companies that stable LNG routes may be worth more than the market believed only months ago. And it tells Canada something bigger. Canada's old weakness may have become its new strength. For decades, Canada had massive gas reserves but limited global reach. Canadian producers could drill the gas, but they often sold into the North American market, where prices were shaped by US supply, pipeline limits, and regional demand. Canada had the resource, but not enough access to the world. LNG Canada changed that. In June 2025, LNG Canada loaded its first cargo from Kitimat, British Columbia. That was not just a milestone for one project. It was the moment Canada entered the large-scale LNG export club. The first phase has 14 million tons per year of capacity. Shell owns 40%. Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Kogas also hold stakes. That first cargo changed the map. For the first time, Canada was not just a gas producer selling mostly south. Canada became an LNG exporter with direct Pacific access to Asia. A molecule of gas could move from the Montney through Western infrastructure to Kitimat onto a ship and across the Pacific to customers looking for security. That is why Shell's ARC deal matters far beyond Calgary. This is not just one company buying another company. It is a global LNG player trying to own more of the chain before the chain itself becomes more valuable. In calm markets, buyers care about price. In crisis markets, buyers care about price and reliability. In panic markets, reliability becomes part of the price. That is the shift. Shell is not only buying production, it is buying depth, it is buying optionality, it is buying more gas and liquids in a basin that can support a facility where Shell already has the biggest stake. It is buying a stronger position before other players fully reprice Canada's LNG future. Now, this is where the hype has to be separated from the real story. No, Canada has not instantly become an energy empire. No, Shell's deal does not guarantee LNG Canada Phase 2 will happen. No, one acquisition does not make Canada the single biggest winner from the Middle East crisis. But yes, the direction is real. Canada has large gas reserves. Canada has a Pacific coast. Canada has allies looking for safer supply. Canada has a major LNG facility already operating. Canada has a possible expansion under active discussion. And now Shell, one of the world's most experienced LNG companies, is moving to deepen its Canadian resource base. That is not noise. That is capital making a statement. This situation is moving fast. By the time mainstream media covers the full picture, the moment to understand it may have passed. Subscribe so you are always ahead of the story, not catching up to it. Because the real story is not the headline number. It is the structure underneath it. Look at what Shell is building. Groundbirch already feeds LNG Canada. ARC would add more Montney production near Shell's existing assets. LNG Canada gives Shell a Pacific export outlet. Phase 2, if approved, could increase that outlet in a major way. And global buyers, especially in Asia, are now looking at secure supply with a different level of fear. This is how energy power is built. Not with one press conference, not with one slogan, not with one political promise. It is built by controlling the pieces other countries need when the world becomes unstable. On May 14, 2026, Canada, British Columbia, and LNG Canada announced enhanced cooperation to advance remaining items that could support a potential final investment decision for Phase 2 by the end of 2026. Before that, on May 1st, LNG Canada's partners approved hundreds of millions of dollars in extra pre-FID work. But this is critical. Phase 2 is not approved yet. It still depends on commercial terms, fiscal conditions, regulatory approvals, and governance decisions. That means it is not a done deal. It is not guaranteed. It is still a live decision. But the fact that governments and the company are trying to close the remaining gaps tells you something. They know the window is open. They know buyers are nervous. They know Canada's chance may be larger now than it was before the Hormuz crisis. And they know that if Canada waits too long, someone else will sell into the gap. If Phase 2 moves forward, LNG Canada's output would double. Canada's Major Projects Office says the project is expected to become the world's second largest LNG facility and attract about 33 billion Canadian dollars in private capital. Second largest, not largest. That correction matters because credibility matters. The story is already big enough without exaggeration. A major Shell deal. A 40% Shell stake in LNG Canada. A first Canadian large-scale LNG cargo already shipped. A 14 million ton per year Phase 1. A proposed Phase 2 that could double output. A global shipping crisis around Hormuz. A possible LNG supply loss through 2030. A world full of buyers looking for safer routes. That is the story. For Canadians, the meaning is obvious. Canada has spent years arguing about whether it can still build major projects. Pipelines became political wars. LNG became a test of regulation, indigenous partnership, climate policy, and national ambition. Investors questioned whether Canada could move fast enough. Critics said Canada had resources but no execution. Supporters said Canada was leaving money and influence on the table while competitors moved ahead. Kitimat now gives Canada an answer. The first cargo proved Canada can export LNG at scale. Phase 2 would test whether Canada can move from entry-level exporter to serious global player. Shell's ARC deal shows that at least one global giant believes Canadian gas is not a side story anymore. For Americans, the meaning is different, but still important. The United States is already one of the world's dominant LNG exporters. U.S. Gulf Coast projects are central to global supply. When Middle East cargoes are disrupted, American LNG often becomes a replacement option. That gives the U.S. power. But Canada's rise changes the North American energy picture. For years, Canadian gas often needed the U.S. market. Now Canadian gas has a Pacific exit. That does not make Canada an enemy or even a direct rival in a simple way. The US and Canada are allies, trading partners, and deeply connected energy economies. But it does give Canada more leverage, more choices, more customers, more bargaining power, more ability to sell to Asia without depending only on the US market. And in trade politics, options matter. When a country has only one major customer, the customer has power. When a country has several customers, the seller gains room to move. LNG Canada is not just an export plant, it is an option machine. That is why this story connects to Canada's larger strategy. Canada has been trying to diversify beyond the United States for years. Every tariff fight, every border dispute, every Buy American push, every election cycle in Washington reminds Ottawa of the same uncomfortable truth. The United States may be Canada's closest partner, but dependence is still dependence. Energy exports to Asia do not replace the U.S. relationship. They do not erase geography. They do not end North American integration. But they do give Canada another lane. And in a world of war, sanctions, tariffs, and supply shocks, another lane can be worth billions. There is also a local story in British Columbia. Kitimat and the surrounding region could see jobs, contracts, and long-term investment. Indigenous communities are part of that discussion too, including questions of partnership, benefits, consent, and environmental impact. But there are also real concerns. LNG projects bring questions about emissions, methane, land use, water, and whether countries should be expanding fossil fuel infrastructure at a time when governments also say they want lower emissions. Supporters argue LNG can help allies reduce dependence on more dangerous suppliers and, in some cases, replace coal. Critics argue new LNG infrastructure can lock in fossil fuel use for decades. Both arguments matter. And that is why this is not a simple good news story or bad news story. It is a power story. Do you think Canada is making a smart energy move here, or is it taking too big a bet on LNG while the world is trying to cut emissions? That question sits at the center of this whole debate, because there are two clocks running at the same time. One clock is the climate clock. Governments are under pressure to cut emissions, build clean power, electrify industry, and reduce dependence on fossil fuels. The other clock is the security clock. Countries still need electricity, heat, fertilizer, steel, manufacturing, and backup power right now. When war threatens supply, governments do not tell voters to wait for a perfect energy system. They look for cargoes. LNG sits between those two clocks. That is why it is politically complicated and commercially powerful. For Asia, LNG is often treated as a bridge fuel, especially where coal is still heavily used. But that depends on what LNG replaces, how methane is controlled, how long contracts last, and whether gas delays cleaner energy. For investors, the question is not only whether demand exists today. The question is whether enough demand remains long enough to justify huge infrastructure costs. Shell appears to believe the answer is yes, at least for Canada. But Shell is also protecting itself. ARC is not just dry gas. ARC's production includes liquids, and Shell said liquids represented a large share of ARC's revenues. That matters because liquids can support returns even if gas prices move. It also matters because condensate is important in Western Canada, especially for blending with heavy oil so it can move through pipelines. So this is not a one-dimensional bet. It is an upstream bet. It is an LNG bet. It is a Canadian gas bet. It is a global security bet. And it is a bet that the world will pay more for secure energy when insecure energy becomes harder to move. The counterpoint is clear. Big deals can fail. ARC shareholders still have to approve the transaction. Courts and regulators still matter. Shell expects the deal to close in the second half of 2026, but that depends on approvals. Phase 2 can also fail. Costs can rise. Fiscal terms can disappoint. Pipeline and infrastructure questions can slow the process. Indigenous negotiations can take time. Environmental rules can become tougher. LNG buyers may demand prices the partners do not like. Global LNG markets may loosen if supply from the United States, Qatar, and other exporters comes online faster than expected. None of this is guaranteed, but energy power is often built in moments of risk. Companies that wait for perfect clarity often miss the price. Companies that move too early can lose money. Companies that move at the right moment can shape the market. Shell appears to believe this is the right moment, and you can see why. When Middle East supply becomes uncertain, buyers search for replacement cargoes. When Qatar's output faces disruption or delays, buyers look at the United States, Australia, and other suppliers. When ships struggle to move through Hormuz, Pacific routes from stable allies become more attractive. Canada cannot replace Qatar. Canada cannot replace the United States. LNG Canada alone cannot solve Asia's energy security problem, but it does not have to solve everything. In a tight market, new secure supply does not need to replace the whole system. It only needs to be credible, reliable, and connected. That is what buyers pay for. A Japanese utility does not need Canada to dominate the world. It needs cargoes that arrive on time. A Korean buyer does not need a speech about energy superpower status. It needs supply diversity. An Indian importer does not need political branding. It needs options when Gulf routes become risky. Canada's pitch is becoming simple. Stable country. Large resource. Pacific access. Allied supplier. Operating LNG facility. Possible expansion. Lower route risk to Asia. That pitch is powerful because it is practical, and this matters in Washington too. American policymakers should not see Canadian LNG only as competition. They should also see it as allied supply in a dangerous world. The more secure energy comes from North America, the less leverage hostile states have over import-dependent democracies. But there is still competition. US LNG exporters want market share. Canadian LNG wants market share. Qatar wants to protect its position. Australia wants to remain a major Pacific supplier. Buyers want price, reliability, contract flexibility, and cleaner supply profiles. The future market will not be decided by slogans. It will be decided by who can deliver when the world is calm and when the world is not. That is where Canada still has to prove itself. One first cargo is a milestone. It is not a dynasty. One Shell acquisition is a signal. It is not a guarantee. One Phase 2 cooperation deal is progress. It is not a final investment decision. Canada still has to execute. It has to control costs. It has to maintain Indigenous partnerships. It has to handle environmental scrutiny. It has to expand infrastructure without letting timelines drift for years. It has to convince investors that Canada can approve and build major projects at the speed this opportunity requires, because the opportunity will not wait forever. Global LNG is full of competitors. The United States, Qatar, Australia, and others are all fighting for buyers. Canada has to earn the contracts. And that brings us back to Shell. Shell understands the entire LNG chain. It can produce gas, manage liquefaction exposure, trade cargoes, structure contracts, optimize shipping, and sell into global markets. When Shell strengthens its position near LNG Canada, the market reads that as more than a local upstream deal. It reads it as an LNG strategy. That is why ARC matters. If Shell only wanted production, it could buy assets in many places. Instead, it moved in the Montney, near its own Canadian assets. At the same time, Canada's Pacific LNG route is becoming more important. At the same time, Phase 2 is moving toward a possible decision. And at the same time, Asian LNG security has been shaken by Hormuz. That sequence is the story, not one event, a chain. Hormuz tightens. Gulf shipping becomes uncertain. LNG buyers rethink route risk. Canada's first cargo proves the Pacific path. Phase 2 moves closer to a possible decision. Shell deepens its Montney position. Canada's LNG story gets repriced. That does not mean the ending is already written. It means the board has changed. For workers, businesses, governments, and families, the impact can move in different directions. More LNG can mean construction jobs, drilling activity, engineering work, port services, tax revenue, and indigenous business opportunities. It can also mean harder questions about domestic gas prices, emissions, land use, and whether Canada is building for the future or extending the past. That is why energy is never just energy. It becomes food prices because fertilizer needs gas. It becomes factory output because industry needs heat and power. It becomes military strategy because shipping lanes need protection. It becomes election politics because voters punish governments when bills rise. It becomes diplomacy because countries with secure supply suddenly get phone calls from everyone. That is what Canada is stepping into. The exciting version of the story says Canada is becoming an energy superpower. The cautious version says Canada has a rare opening, but only if it can build, approve, finance, and operate at the level global buyers demand. The truth is between those two lines. Canada has not rewritten the energy game by declaration. It has begun rewriting its position through infrastructure. That is slower, harder, and more real. Shell is not pouring billions into Canadian LNG because of patriotism. Shell is moving because the assets, timing, and global trends appear to point in the same direction. The Middle East crisis made secure supply more valuable. LNG Canada gave Canada a working Pacific export platform. ARC would give Shell more upstream strength in the basin feeding that platform. Phase 2 could turn the platform from important to globally significant. That is the thesis. The risk is execution. If Phase 2 stalls, Shell still gets ARC's production and reserves, but the biggest LNG growth story becomes less powerful. If global LNG prices weaken, returns could tighten. If Canadian politics slows the project, investors may question the timeline. If the Hormuz crisis eases and Qatari supply recovers faster than expected, some urgency may fade. But if the crisis continues, if buyers demand secure long-term supply, if Phase 2 reaches FID, and if Shell closes ARC, then Canada's position changes sharply. Canada becomes more than a resource holder. It becomes a route, and routes matter in a fractured world. The Strait of Hormuz has shown the market that the shortest route is not always the safest route. Europe learned the same lesson with Russian pipeline gas. Asia is learning it now with Gulf LNG. The next energy system will not be judged only by the cheapest molecule. It will be judged by the most dependable network. Canada wants to be part of that network. Shell is moving like it believes Canada can be. Most people following this story are getting the surface version. Subscribers here get the full picture, what it means, why it matters, and what is coming next. Do not settle for half the story, because the next question is not whether Shell made a big move. It did. The next question is whether Canada can turn that move into national leverage. That means Ottawa and British Columbia must decide whether LNG Canada Phase 2 is just another industrial project or a strategic national project. The language from government already points toward the second option. Energy security, export diversification, private capital, jobs, allies, and sovereignty. That word matters. For Canada, sovereignty means having infrastructure that turns resources into choices. For the United States, it means stronger North American supply when global routes break. For Asia, it means another democratic supplier across the Pacific. For Shell, it means a chance to build a Canadian LNG heartland before the world fully prices in the risk. That is why the deal has weight. Not because it guarantees Canada wins, not because LNG has no risks, not because the climate debate disappears, but because it shows a major company positioning itself before the next stage of the market becomes obvious to everyone, and that is usually when the most important bets are made. By the time everyone agrees an asset is strategic, the cheap moment is gone. Shell is not waiting for final consensus. It is moving now. Canada's LNG story is no longer theoretical. The first cargo has sailed. Shell has moved on ARC. Phase 2 is moving toward a possible decision, and the Hormuz crisis has shown buyers why a Pacific route from a stable North American ally may be worth far more than it looked before. But the next threat is not only in the Middle East. It is whether Canada's own politics, permitting, costs, and climate fight slow the project before the market window closes. In my next video, I'm covering how Canada's LNG push could trigger a new fight with the United States over energy power, Asian buyers, and the future of North American trade. And what I found will change how you see this.